Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Tax and Superannuation Laws Amendment 2015, Measures No. 3 Bill 2015, and I'm happy to rise to support this bill because it's part of a broader package of policies and legislation which is about repairing our budget, repairing the Commonwealth's budget after years of neglect and years of a failure to control our nation's budget. And it's one of the primary tasks that the Australian people give to us, the trust they give to us in this place, is to manage their money properly. Perhaps not the primary task, perhaps the primary task is making sure we keep Australia safe and secure from external and internal threats. And I think, though, that's something that both sides of politics do a reasonable job at all times doing. But the other thing that's very important for we as elected representatives is to make sure that we carefully spend Australians' people's money, and we carefully ensure that we don't spend more than we can afford and don't burden future generations with an undue sacrifice to have to pay back from the lack of frugality from those in present positions. Now, the government's made a big attempt to do that. It has been frustrated at some levels, but at the same time, overall, the government has delivered more than $50 billion in savings since coming to government. This bill provides two additional policy areas of savings for that overall $50 billion package. In the overall scheme of things, they are relatively small savings, but they are still nonetheless contributions to that broader effort. The first aspect of this bill, there are two schedules in this bill, one dealing with the seafarer tax offset, the other with R&D tax offsets. The first schedule looks at or amends, I should say, the Income Tax Assessment Act 1997 to abolish the seafarer tax offset, and that offset provides a refundable tax offset to companies for 30% of salary, wages and allowances paid to Australian resident seafarers. In order for the offset to apply, the Australian resident seafarer must be employed to undertake overseas voyages on a qualifying vessel by a company for at least 91 days in the income year. This was a tax offset introduced by the former government, and look, it was admirably intentioned at the time. It was implemented as part of a range of packages to try and spur and grow Australia's shipping industry. It is the case that other countries, some tax benefits apply to their local industries, and the government the then Labor government was seeking to do something here similar. The offset became available for use after the 1st of July 2012, but this government, on coming to power, has decided to abolish the tax offset because it hasn't been used and it has been proven to be ineffective in its original objective of growing Australia's sea shipping industry. When the package was announced by the former government in the 2011-12 MyEFO, the Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook, the seafarer tax offset was estimated to have cost around $39 million over the then 4-year forward estimate period, but that cost has been revised down progressively because the offset has been failed to be used as much as originally expected. Indeed, over the forward estimates in the 2013-14 MyEFO, it was revised down at that time. That was the first budget outlook that was provided by the new government. Of course, abolishing this offset reverses the amount of cost or revenue lost, in a more accurate way of describing it, across those four-year forward estimates in that 2013-14 MyEFO. Now, why is the government abolishing this particular offset? Well, this former package, as I said, did seek to stimulate investment in and the revitalisation of the Australian shipping industry and to foster the industry's global competitiveness. But we are abolishing this tax offset because it is not achieving its policy intent, which was ultimately to stimulate opportunities for Australian seafarers to be employed on overseas voyages and to gain maritime skills. The savings from this measure will be redirected by the government to repair the budget and fund other policy priorities. The measure will reduce administered expenses by around $16 million in fiscal balance terms over the forward estimates, and in underlying cash terms it will improve the budget bottom line by around $12 million over the forward estimates. Those estimates are lower, of course, as I discussed earlier, than the original $39 million cost of the scheme, because it has not been taken up as much as originally thought. The measure, because it hasn't been taken up as much as originally thought, it won't affect a substantial number of Australian companies. Its abolition, I should say, won't affect a substantial number of companies. The 2013 Australian Maritime Industry Census Report, published by the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, includes statistics on the total number of Australian resident seafarers working in the maritime industry. The report indicates that there are around just over 1,000 seafarers directly employed by organisations in that sector. The department also publishes statistics on the number of certificates issued to companies deeming them eligible for a range of shipping tax incentives, including this particular tax incentive, the seafarer tax offsets. Certificates apply per company, per vessel and per income year. According to these statistics in Australian Tax Office information, less than 5 companies would be affected by the abolition of this tax offset. Less than 5 companies, and only around 10%, just a bit under 10%, representing just under 10% of the employment in the sector. So the purpose of this tax offset was to stimulate investment, but clearly hasn't done that, given that only 5 companies have actually pervaded themselves with the opportunity to take this offset up. Now, it's of course not possible to precisely determine why the tax offset has not been taken up to a greater degree, but a number of factors may be at play. Firstly, the competitiveness of the Australian seafaring industry is affected by a range of economic factors, including the Australian exchange rate, which has been relatively elevated, I should say, in the past few years. Secondly, there are significant differences between Australian wages and conditions in the shipping industry and those of some other countries. The seafarer tax offset is unlikely itself to be sufficient to bridge the gap between those differences. And finally, the seafarer tax offset is a refundable tax offset to the value of 30% of salary, wages and allowances paid to Australian resident seafarers, and the benefit offered by the seafarer tax offset may be small relative to the scale of shipping companies, and of course it's only refundable, not a direct grant. The measure is actually separate from the government's other reforms to the Australian shipping industry, notably those affecting the coastal shipping industry. They have been subject to separate reviews and a separate response to the issues there. Although I will draw some links between the issues around the lack of use of this seafaring tax offset and the broader Australian shipping industry. Of course, there is no argument. That the Australian shipping industry faces challenges, and particularly challenges around profitability and economics. And the very fact that it has been a difficult economic time perhaps indicates why this offset hasn't been taken up, and why also that we should actually seek to correct the underlying profitable issues with the sector before introducing tax offsets themselves, because ultimately if shipping companies aren't making money, a refundable tax offset is not going to change that. By definition, they'd need to be making money first before they could benefit from a refundable tax offset. So the coastal shipping industry is a part of the broader Australian shipping industry, and unfortunately in the past decade or so it has been declining as a share of our nation's freight task, and declining in absolute terms as well. And that's notwithstanding similar attempts by the former Labor government to stimulate investment and uptake in coastal shipping, notably the changes that the Labor Party or the Labor government introduced in 2012, called the Revitalising Australian Shipping Act. Part of other things, it didn't quite meet the lofty goal set for it in the title of the bill, although that's not unusual. Often people that are trying to hide something else include the various words in bills that don't actually achieve things, and that's not just true of bills. I mean, the German Democratic Republic was hardly democratic, and the Labor's Coastal Shipping Revitalising Australian Shipping Bill is hardly a revitalising piece of legislation, because since that bill, or after the first 2 years of that bill was introduced, there was actually a 63% decline in the carrying capacity of Australia's coastal trading fleet. It was a piece of legislation that was intended, in fact, to increase and grow our coastal trading effort, but the coastal trading fleet fell by 63% in tonnage terms over just 2 years. Taking a longer-term view, the fleet of major Australian ships, over 2,000 deadweight tonnes with coastal licences, is in sharp decline, plummeting from 30 vessels in 2006-07 to just 15 in 2013-14, a halving in the number of vessels in just 7 years. Over a 12-year period between 2000 and 2012, shipping's share of Australian freight fell from 27% of our freight task to just under 17%, while the volume of freight across Australia actually grew by 57%. And even looking forward, the picture is not much rosier, because between 2010 and 2030, over broadly the next 20 years, Australia's freight task is expected to grow by 80%, but coastal shipping itself is only expected to grow by 15%, meaning that its relative share of our freight task will continue to decline. And that decline is being driven by basic economics and basic costs. I am often told by manufacturers, in particular, that the cost of bringing or moving Australian freight along coastlines is so excessive that it's actually, in fact, much cheaper to import competing products that compete against our domestic manufacturers, or indeed sometimes farmers, cheaper from overseas because of the differential in freight costs. One particular example I'll mention is that a soft drink manufacturer in Melbourne reported to me that it's cheaper to import sugar from Brazil than to import sugar from North Queensland. And that sugar, of course, is priced on a world market, so there's no difference in the price of the raw sugar, FOB if you like, but the difference is completely to do with the freight costs and other transaction costs of shipping between overseas shipping and coastal shipping in Australia. So something has to be done. Something has to be done. The government has a plan to liberalise the stagnant and stultifying regulations that were introduced by the Labor Party. The government has a plan to increase the amount of freight that goes by coastal shipping, and ultimately to also increase the number of Australian employees on those ships, because we will set minimum numbers of Australian employees on even coastal ships as part of those reforms. Unfortunately, those reforms are being blocked at the moment, and there will be no sunlight for the Australian coastal shipping industry if we just simply maintain the existing set of regulations, which are clearly not doing anyone any favours. But I support Schedule 1 of this bill because it will deliver those savings, those multi-million-dollar savings, albeit small in the context of the entire budget. But you count your pennies and eventually you end up saving pounds, and that's what this government is doing with this bill here. It is also looking at this bill also looks at the research and development tax incentives and offsets that exist in our legislation, and seeking to slightly modify those. I am a big supporter of our R&D tax system. Indeed, we were a trailblazer among the world in introducing R&D tax credits of the kind that we have in Australia. Other countries ultimately have largely followed us, particularly developed countries, in introducing things like this. But the good thing about our R&D tax system is it is largely generic. It doesn't seek to pick winners or identify particular sectors that we here think we know better than private businesses and private financiers in the real world. What we seek to do is provide a generic support for all types of R&D across our economy, and ultimately let those that are putting their own money at risk to make the decisions about which businesses deserve their particular support and funding. In saying that, it is a costly element of the budget. Indeed, I don't have the figures in front of me, but when I used to be an economist at the Productivity Commission, I believe we used to estimate government assistance at around $17 billion a year or so, and a good $8 billion or so was made up just of this particular measure itself. As I say, something that should be supported and is supported by both sides of politics, but nonetheless a very costly form of industry assistance as in the whole. The government has announced a slight reduction in the rate of offset rates for the R&D tax incentive. Currently, there are rates of 45% and 40%, depending on the size of businesses, and those offset rates will reduce by 1.5 percentage points for both of those, from 45% to 43.5%, and of course from 40% to 38.5% if people are wanting to follow the maths. It was intended that this legislation, I should say the change from a tax concession to a tax incentive was done in 2011 by the former government, and in the 2014-15 budget it was announced to reduce these offset rates by this 1.5% margin. We believe that there is around, we can know from the stats that around 9,500 consolidated groups claimed the R&D tax incentive in the 2012-13 year, and the government's original decision to reduce these offset rates was to commence on the 1st of July 2014, keeping in mind the need to repair our budget, as I said in my opening remarks. The changes were estimated to provide the budget savings of $810 million in fiscal balance terms over the forward estimates and $740 million over the forward estimates in underlying cash terms. That, of course, estimate has changed since, given the change in timing of this bill and the change in timing of getting it through, particularly the Senate. The current estimates of savings are around $620 million in fiscal balance terms and $550 million in underlying cash terms. It's important to note that this particular measure won't affect the eligibility of companies or the broad workings of the R&D tax incentive, as I said, which broadly has bipartisan support in this chamber, and that won't change. All that will simply change is the offset rates itself, and also combined with the government's change to company tax rate for small businesses, the benefits of the R&D tax incentive won't change in net terms, because while the tax offset will reduce by 1.5 percentage points, the government has also changed the corporate tax rate for small businesses earning with a turnover of less than $2 million by 1.5 percentage points. So in net terms there will not be an impact for smaller businesses. Data from the 2011-12 income tax year indicates there are approximately 4,400 companies with aggregated turnover of less than $2 million who also claimed the R&D tax incentive. So those firms won't be affected themselves. The only that will have a slight reduction in their ability to claim offsets will be larger companies that haven't been able to benefit from that corporate tax change. I have spoken to some in the industry about this particular measure, and while there is some concern that we haven't been able to achieve a 1.5 percentage point reduction in the corporate tax rate overall, again, that is a function of the tight budget we have and the difficulty with that we cannot do perhaps all we would like in this area. In saying that, there is a Senate inquiry at the moment on innovation, and it has looked closely at this issue as well as a broad range of issues affecting innovation. And while that inquiry has been going on, the government has announced other plans, particularly in relation to STEM industries, to science, technology, engineering and maths, and particularly to implement a range of industry growth centres focusing on delivering innovation in key sectors across our economy. Combined with this change should see in the context of those other support measures that the government has bolstered over time that will continue to allow and ensure that Australia has a strong innovation sector, a strong research and development sector, and an industry which has largely relied on encouraging private actors to take initiative, to take a risk, to have a go, and see if they can make a new product that is better, more cost-efficient, and ultimately delivers better outcomes for the Australian people. But I return, Mr Acting Deputy President, to the reasons for these bills. Their core reason is to ensure that we do not leave the next generation with a greater burden that we face. And clearly on the current trajectory that we are, even notwithstanding these measures and these kinds of measures, we are set to do that. We are set to do that because whatever you think of the assumptions in the intergenerational report, they clearly show that we would leave our or my grandchildren with a burden somewhere in the order of $60,000 to $120,000 in debt per person. And that's not something I want to deliver, and I'll do everything I can in this chamber to ensure that doesn't happen. These particular bills will help moderate that increase, and I hope they achieve the support of this chamber. Thank you, Mr. Director.